All right, good morning, everybody. I am David Carmichael. I'm the director of the State Archives, and on behalf of the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, and most particularly the State Archives, I want to welcome you once again to our annual Archives and Records Management Seminar. Let me just start off by saying we are recording these sessions, so just please be aware of that. Thank you for attending. I hope you're going to find this very worth your time. We've worked hard to make it that way. Before we begin, I wanted to take just about 5 minutes and update you on some of the things the State Archives is doing that we think will benefit many of you. And some of them we've been talking about for a number of years, and finally we're seeing some significant movement. So I'm happy to report on them. The first is the Digital Archives and Digital Record Center. We've been talking about this for years, the DADRIC, as we're calling it. And DADRIC is going to provide preservation storage for electronic records that have a very long-term retention, permanent records in the archives, and long-term retention for state agency records that have to be kept many, many years before they can be destroyed. I think the State Archives does a very good job of preserving paper records, but for a long, long time, we've been working toward providing that same level of preservation for electronic records, and DADRIC is intended to do just that. Unlike traditional computer storage, the DADRIC will perform systematic preservation actions on the records to make certain that they remain readable for hundreds of years even. And this project is a joint undertaking between the State Archives and the Commonwealth's Office of Information Technology. And I want to thank OIT for being really excellent partners with us in this project. They've worked with us for a couple of years to make this happen. We have the support of the Governor's Budget Office, and I certainly want to thank them, because without that, we wouldn't be moving forward. So I'm glad to report that in August, we issued an RFP, and at the end of September, we began scoring the submissions we received. So we hope to have a system in place by the middle of 2023. We are very optimistic that DADRIC will provide state agencies with a viable option for retaining records electronically, even if they have really long retention periods. The plan is to be able to store permanent archival records from the State Archives in the system, as well as records that eventually can be destroyed, but have retention periods of say 75 years or 100 years before that happens. So this is another major step toward reducing the Commonwealth's reliance on paper. And we are very, very happy about it, so stay tuned. You're going to hear much more about DADRIC in the days ahead if you are a state agency. Meanwhile, the software that we use to manage the State Record Center is approaching end of life in December of 2022. So we've been working on a replacement strategy, and over the summer we issued an RFI, and we are now working to finalize our selection so that we can begin migrating to whatever solution we select. This is the system that we use to track the locations of over 200,000 boxes in the State Record Center. But as we've looked at the new solution, we've kept in mind that this is also the system that state agency employees use to transfer records to the State Record Center and use to request them and authorize their disposition. So we have placed a big emphasis on ease of use. And I just want to mention that implementing a new system is giving us the opportunity to revisit all of our policies and procedures around the State Record Center. We don't want to simply recreate what we do today if we can streamline the process in the future. So watch for more information on that. There will probably be process changes and policy changes, but we will certainly keep everyone informed well in advance of any changes. So watch for that. And then lastly, finally, if you've driven down 6th Street in Harrisburg lately, you might have noticed some construction activity. The federal courthouse is being built. There's a new traffic circle being built, I noticed. And in my very, very biased opinion, the most beautiful construction project of all, the new State Archives building is being constructed. We began construction just as the pandemic struck, but I have to give great credit to DGS and the various contractors, because despite the pandemic, the building is largely on schedule at the moment, not entirely, but it's awfully close. So we've not experienced major delays yet. We've not yet experienced major delays because of supply chain problems, knock on wood. And if that continues, then we expect to move into the new building by late summer or early fall next year. There are likely to be some disruptions to archival services as we get close to the move, but we're trying to minimize the impact on state agencies and local governments. So we will try to keep you very informed as we get closer to the move. I've calculated, by the way, that moving the state archives is the equivalent of moving a 3-bedroom house about 78 times. So it is no small undertaking, as you can imagine. There's a lot of preparation going on at the archives right now, but we are very excited about the prospects, and we hope you'll get a chance to drive by and see it, and then come visit us when we are in the new building. All right, enough about updates from the archives. On that note, let's get to our main program, and to do that, I'm going to turn you over to Cindy Bendroth.
All right, thank you, David. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Bendroth. I'm the Division Chief of Record Services here at the State Archives. And I'm very excited to introduce our next speakers because they've helped me try to understand the records management implications in the new Microsoft 365 world. And just to give you some context, the state agencies moved to M365 during the pandemic, and that's what it sounds like everybody did, especially teams. So now we have a platform not only for storing records, but for chatting and collaborating and conferencing, telephoning. It's all in one place. We have OneDrive you can store records. You have Teams that you can use to call and chat and keep records. And you've got SharePoint. So as a records manager, I will need to know where to tell you Commonwealth employees what to do with your records. So I started talking to different colleagues or listening to different sessions all over the country. And many of them, like us, were starting to use Teams during the pandemic and providing, trying to get some guidance for people. So Elizabeth Adkins was one of the first that I've heard, and she did a wonderful introduction to Teams and the records issues. So I've asked her to give a similar talk here. And Elizabeth is the Director of Information Governance at Davis, Wright, Tremaine, and started her career as a corporate archivist and then transitioned in 2001 first to records management and then to information governance. She's the past president of the Society of American Archivists and Academy of Certified Archivists and has been active in the records management and information government communities. She's a certified archivist emeritus, a certified records manager, and a certified information governance professional, and in 2019 was named the Information Governance Leader of the Year by the Information Governance Initiative. So if anybody knows Teams, it's got to be Elizabeth. Our second speaker, unfortunately, is not available today. She did have the foresight to record her session, and she was another person that I heard during the pandemic. And that is Meaghan Fukunaga, who's the Deputy Director of Records Management for the Indiana Archives and Records Administration. She holds an MLS in Archives and Records Management from University of Michigan, and she began her career with digital content management and then moved over to digital collections to the Indianapolis Public Library, and now oversees the state of Indiana's Records Management Division with a specialization of electronic records management. And what we'll hear Meaghan talk about with limited resources, especially during the pandemic and not being able to get third-party solutions. She's talking about how she tried to manage the 365 environments. And then lastly, but not least, we have somebody to speak about the county perspective. And counties are also able to use the Microsoft 365 through the County Commissioners Association of PA. They have licensing agreements. So Phillip Walters has been with Adams County for 9 years as the Chief Information Officer. And he's been working on improving county public service delivery through relationship building, technological solutions, risk reduction, and appropriate portfolio management. So at the please feel free to put questions in the Q&A or even the chat, and we'll be answering, or they will be answering the questions at the end. All right, I'll pass it on to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. Unfortunately, I've gotten to know quite a bit about Teams over the last few years. It's been somewhat traumatic event, but let me see, hang on, where is my view? Oh, here we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. So, here we go. Sorry, I was looking for my note screen. All right. So let me I'll cover briefly what Wright Tremaine is and about Grant Thornton. I recently transitioned from Grant Thornton, which is an accounting and advisory firm, to Wright Tremaine, which is a law firm. Most of this presentation is going to be about Grant Thornton, but I can tell you I am reliving some of these things right now. So there are commonalities, I think, throughout. So first, a little bit, Wright Tremaine is one of the top 100 American law firms. It has about 1,300 employees, including more than 550 lawyers. And it's headquartered in Seattle, Washington, has offices in 7 other cities in the United States. So I joined Wright Tremaine in August as Director of Information Governance. Prior to that, I had the same title at Grant Thornton. So now let me tell you a little bit about Grant Thornton. Grant Thornton LLP is the U.S. member of Grant Thornton International. So it is one of the world's leading organizations of independent audit, tax, and advisory firms. Bigger than Wright Tremaine. We had nearly $2 billion in revenue, 55 offices, but like Wright Tremaine, really focused on the U.S. So our focus is the U.S. and the District of Columbia. 8,700, I've said R. I'm still used to saying R with Grant Thornton, bear with me. 8,700 employees. So bigger, but otherwise there's actually quite a few similarities between Grant Thornton and Wright Tremaine. So at Grant Thornton, the company has been a very big Microsoft 365 user, or actually a very big consumer of Microsoft services and technologies. And so Grant Thornton started looking at Teams really pretty early in the scheme of things in January of 2018. And I believe Teams was released by Microsoft the previous year. So it was still something rather brand new. And a small number of us in IT, information governance, knowledge management, and legal sort of played around with it a bit. We were exploring some ideas for how it might be leveraged at Grant Thornton. And the knowledge management team was very interested in exploring what it would take to use Teams to support our client engagements. And so in July of 2018, they opened up a small pilot for a handful of groups to kind of experiment with the use of Teams for supporting client engagements, and they loved it. And so after that, we started trying to figure out how we could release it firm-wide, but we did learn from our experiences in 2018, there were a lot of governance issues we needed to tackle first. And we started on a rather long and painful journey as to figuring out how those governance controls should work. We initially banned the use for client-facing engagements. Within Grant Thornton, the highest risk content is anything having to do with client engagements. And so we really wanted any use in that perspective to be really nailed down. And we weren't ready for that by July of 2019. And then, as you all know, COVID happened. So in March of 2020, everybody went home. And at that point, there was already a demand by people who had discovered it for the use of Teams. Now it became a groundswell. And so by September of 2020, we released a new tool to help us enable the collection of critical metadata and to help with pre-approval processes prior to provisioning. And so that was where we stood. And it's been getting more and more complex since then. For those of you who may not know Teams really well, I'm going to go through a slide here that kind of explains how Teams works. This interface, by the way, is slightly outdated. You may or may not notice a few things that are not pertinent anymore, but it was too hard to build. So yeah, this is just, for the most part, it works. It explains how it works. So on the left-hand side, we have a list of teams. And so anytime you create a team, you create what's called, and it says here, O365, now they're calling it Microsoft 365 groups. And we'll talk more about groups in a bit. And then within a team, they're what they're called channels, and each of which has their own persistent posts, which were formerly called conversations. And then there are folders within each channel as well. And there are other possibilities for adding applications within channels. And then the posts are right here on the right. These are topic driven, and it's activity that is tracked within each channel. And you can actually use what's called the @mention feature right here. If you can see, I know it's right here, kind of hard to see, but I mentioned a colleague of mine and it brought her name. And so that sent her an email notification that she had been mentioned in a Teams channel post. And then at the top of each channel, there are what are called tabs. And these include the standard channel will always come with something called, now it's called posts. At the time this was captured, it was called conversations, files, and a wiki. And you can add more. There's a little plus sign here, and we'll talk more about that later. But there's always a SharePoint folder and a wiki that comes with each channel. All of the files that are generated or stored within a channel reside in SharePoint, but they can be referenced in posts. Now, one can connect to other Office 365 or Microsoft 365 and third-party apps as a tab within a channel. So you can actually create, and there's two different places, up here where the little plus signal is, and down here where there is the also more apps. Teams also features one-on-one and one-in-many chats. These can either be ad hoc or attached to a previously scheduled meeting. And a lot of people transition to Teams precisely for the chat functionality because Skype went away. Meetings can be held within Teams and can be scheduled via Outlook, and you can access them via Teams right there. So that is a brief tour of how Teams works. Now, why has Teams become popular? Well, first of all, and these are, you have to treat this with a grain of salt. These are stats from Microsoft, but there really are people who adopt it, love the fact that from their perspective, it really helps with collaboration. You can share information with one another without having to set up a meeting. You can collaborate with one another virtually. And so this 150 trips being replaced was pre-pandemic, but obviously the concept is still there. And really a lot of the ability to replace meetings with collaboration in Teams. So as we've mentioned, Teams use is growing quite rapidly. When we first started looking at Teams at Grant Thornton, there were less than 13 million daily active users. By the time the pandemic started, it was 44 million, and within a month it had jumped to 75 million, and then it's just skyrocketed from there. As of July of 2021, 250 million active users. So it has become popular, and it's basically everybody is having to deal with Teams. Now, one of the main things you have to keep in mind when you're working with Teams is the data. And there's all sorts of different data, and it's all stored in different places. So for instance, the chat, most of that information in the chat is stored in your user mailbox. You may not see it, but it's stored in the Exchange user mailbox. If you share a file in a chat as opposed to within a channel post, that file is stored in your OneDrive. Whoever shared it, it gets stored automatically in your OneDrive, whether you had it there originally or not. Within Teams, conversations, which are now called posts, there's bot interactions that you can set up within Teams, connector conversation posts. That's also stored in Exchange in the group mailbox that is set up for every team that is set up. Every team has a corresponding group mailbox. The files, the wikis, the OneNote, that's all stored in SharePoint. When you have a meeting, it's stored in either your user mailbox or in the Exchange group mailbox, depending on how it's set up. And in addition, there's meeting recordings. At one point, they were stored in Stream, but in January of 2021, those recordings are now stored in OneDrive and in SharePoint. Meeting recordings initially went to Stream, where Microsoft had a limit on how much content you could store there, and there was no way to systematically delete the meeting recordings. So they changed it to OneDrive and SharePoint as a way to give you the capability to actually put retention limits on those recordings. And then for calls, there's contacts, voicemail, and transcripts, call history, call summary, all of that is also stored in the user mailbox. Now, I mentioned groups before. Really, when we were going through this journey, I was really focused on Teams and how it operated and how it works. But what I came to learn is that what I should have been paying more attention to was groups. So groups is architectural kind of backbone of Microsoft 365. Within every time you set up a given function, you set up a group behind the scenes, and the controls for how those applications work are often guided via groups. But so, and people are often not even aware what a group is. Some people are. There is, for instance, you can set up what's called a group in Outlook, and that will have an associated SharePoint library associated with it. So you set up a group in Outlook and you get a SharePoint site. That's sort of the complexity of what you need to understand. So this chart shows, and it's a little outdated too, but for the most part, it's still accurate. Yammer, which we had at Grant Thornton. I realize not everyone does have Yammer. You can when you create a Yammer community, you are creating a group. And with that comes Yammer Feed, Planner, SharePoint site, OneNote, and this says Power BI Workspace. This is the thing that has actually gone away. This was an extra charge. Actually, now they don't automatically generate a Power BI Workspace every time you create one of these groups. Power BI, by the way, we could probably have a 3-hour session on Power BI, but it is an analytics tool. And a business intelligence tool that Microsoft offers. If you create a group within Outlook, it comes with all of those things plus an email inbox and a shared calendar. If you create a plan in Planner, it comes with all of those same things. If you create a team, it creates all of those plus a wiki plus Teams chat. So it gets deep. You have to really kind of understand what you're getting into and really understand the significance of groups in terms of imposing controls. So at Grant Thornton, our big challenge was we had a big demand. We had a practice that featured helping people with technology. So we had a lot of people who were very technology savvy, and they discovered Teams and they discovered aspects of Microsoft 365, and they were very excited about it. So we had to balance that demand, which provided a more appealing interface than we had in our systems at the time. And we also had the risk of some of the things that we knew we needed to address via controls, and to address all that in a way that still provided a pleasant user experience for our employees, required considerable investment. And so we were constrained. We didn't have the budget and the resources that we really needed to do it most effectively. And we had an evergreen evolving platform, because the nature of Microsoft 365 is they make changes, and unless you're paying attention to it, you might get caught by surprise by it. So, and in fact, that is the topic of this slide, which essentially Microsoft 365, I mean, one of the good things about it is you don't have to, it's evergreen. It's always updating. You don't have to upgrade to a new version. It's always there to upgrade for you. You don't have to pay more money to migrate it to a new system. But it is like whack-a-mole, because just when you think you got a handle on how things work, something new pops up. And so there are some things that you need to watch out for. Microsoft in general, remember, this is being developed by folks who are techies, so they like to favor self-service and wide sharing. So that may work well for your organization. It may not, and that is part of what you have to be on the lookout. And then they introduce some new things, and if you're not really paying close attention, something new may be provisioned to your employees that you don't really want for them. So for instance, Teams, I think when it was first introduced, it was made available to everyone in your tenant unless you took action. Other new features and functionalities are minor and evolutionary and no big deal. There is a Microsoft 365 roadmap online, and you can get RSS notifications about those changes, but the roadmap has literally hundreds of items on it, and it takes a long time to kind of go through it, digest it, understand what all of them mean, and it doesn't distinguish between minor enhancements and major changes, so it's really tough to stay on top of. And the question is, who is responsible for monitoring that roadmap and knowing what's coming? Another thing to consider is provisioning, and here we kind of got caught. You know, if you go into Office 365 or Microsoft 365 online, there is like a menu app launcher in the upper left-hand corner. It looks what we've always called a waffle. Looks like a waffle. And we thought when we removed Teams from the waffle, that would limit self-provisioning of Teams. And it took us a while to realize that at the bottom of a team screen is the join or create team link. And that meant that anyone who was invited to join a team could create a new one. Now you can change the settings on this. You can disable the link altogether, but if you do that, it disables provisioning of other groups-based Microsoft 365 apps, such as Planner and Power BI, and depending on your organization, that may or may not be a desirable thing. So it kind of, for us, when we were ready to launch to the entire firm, we realized kind of belatedly that self-provisioning was going to be an issue for us and that we would have a tough time controlling it. Then there's guest or external access. So these are actually, I recently learned guest, I thought it was synonymous, guest and external, but they're slightly different things. Guest access gives people access to your teams. External access can give people access to features such as chat. So that is actually something I don't know a whole lot about, but in any event, by default, this is turned off, which is good. When you do set up guest access, it applies to all teams. You can't say, I want guest access to this team, but not to that team. It's at least in the default platform. And it is provisioned via Azure B2B. Azure is Microsoft's cloud services platform. And email domains are whitelisted. or they can actually be blacklisted as well. You can take your choice on that. Once they are enabled for SharePoint Online, they're also enabled for Teams, if you actually have Teams enabled to have guest access. Anyway, it gets complex pretty quickly. If one thing we found out at Grant Thornton, that is guest access is enabled for certain domains, users can conduct private chats with anyone who's been whitelisted in Azure to B2B. So you can turn this capability off in the admin center. It was a problem at Grant Thornton because we were trying to restrict the use of Teams to support client engagements. Then there's chats and posts. So Microsoft's default is to retain chats and posts indefinitely. You can change those retention settings in the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. The minimum retention of chats is 1 day. At the time that Grant Thornton set up retention limits for chats, it was 30 days. And so we set it at 30 days and then wanted to change it to a day later. We wanted to change the setting to go from 30 days to 1 day. And by then, people had already gotten used to having their chats retained for 30 days. Now, for us, the chats were a concern for risk in terms of EDiscovery. Maybe it's no big deal for others, but it was an issue for us. And you can independently set retention limits on posts. Another thing that we ran across was the use of emoji GIFs and GIFs, I don't know how it's pronounced, and stickers. So Microsoft's take is that these things are a great way to add some fun into your communications. And in fact, people are used to using them in social media and in personal use of collaboration platforms. But in certain environments, the use of these things can be a source of legal liability, in particular for EDiscovery. There has been an interesting number of articles written about how emojis play a part in EDiscovery, first in capturing them and then in interpreting what they mean. And we found this sticker in Teams. It said, "Plead the Fifth," and we thought, we really don't want any of our employees using this sticker, which could then come up in litigation and maybe be a source of, maybe it was posted as a joke, but it could be something where, it could be interpreted poorly. So we turned off GIFs and stickers. Emoji cannot be turned off. We're all used to emoji right now, but GIFs and stickers can be turned off. Another thing is in the tabs at the top of each channel, you can add additional applications. And among other things, you can add cloud storage, which makes it easy to import files from other repositories, such as Box, Dropbox, Citrix File Share or ShareFile, Google Drive, in addition to SharePoint Online. So I mentioned earlier that every channel comes with a SharePoint site, but you can also, if you have an existing SharePoint site, you can add a link to that site via a tab. So we found it helpful to be able to link SharePoint Online, but Box, Dropbox, Citrix File, ShareFile, Google Drive, none of these are allowed in our environment. So we had to turn off what cloud storage you could configure to. And then in general, the third-party apps. So the tabs feature, there's a whole library of apps you can add via a tab in a channel. And we were okay with the Microsoft apps. We were a little more concerned about the third-party apps, in part because of the fact that we didn't know what the terms of use were for these third-party apps, and we didn't know where the content might be stored. It might be stored in the control and custody of these vendors as opposed to in our environment. And so that raised concerns for us as well. That is configurable as to what apps you can allow access to in the admin portal. And then we discovered there were even more apps that were available via chats. in the messaging extensions, the 3 dots at the bottom of a chat screen. So that's another thing to look out for. A lot of these concerns came up because of EDiscovery. Now, Microsoft has done a nice job with the Microsoft 365 EDiscovery Center. It can be used to search and place legal holds. It's a pretty sophisticated tool. It does take some time to learn how to use. So it is not necessarily totally intuitive. For us at Grant Thornton, the big concern was we knew that if we ever got into litigation and if we were ever using Teams to support client engagements, we wanted to put everything in the team on hold. You can't easily do that through eDiscovery Center. If you know the URL, so if you have a naming convention, which you can control via groups, if you know the URL, you can put a hold on the entire team. Another thing that has come up is chats and posts, which do come up in litigation. If you have to put a hold on them and you have what's called an E3 license. In government, it would be a G3 license. The legal hold preserves the chats and posts as independent threads, so they're not threaded together. And with an E5 license or G5 license, it can be preserved as a threaded chat or post. But the E5, the G5 license is much more expensive. Now, Grant Thornton eventually invested in an E5 license for security reasons. And I know more and more companies are looking at doing that, but it's a big bite to take. You have to do an ROI analysis to figure out whether it's worth it. And for me, my personal feeling in terms of eDiscovery and information governance is it doesn't add quite enough value to make it worth it, but it is getting more, they're adding more features and functionality that make it worth considering. So I've mentioned groups several times. These are the things you can control via groups. Using an Active Directory security group to define who can create a Microsoft group so that it's not available to everybody, but instead is only available to a select group of people. You can create an expiration policy for groups. You can set it up so that the owners must either renew the group or it self-deletes. You can establish naming conventions, and you can set policies on whether to allow guest or external access. Last year, Microsoft released an updated overview and roadmap of groups. So if you want to learn more about groups, I think I would advise doing some research and checking out their roadmap. Another thing to think about is really essentially who's in charge. We had a lot of discussion about who, quote unquote, owns Microsoft 365 in Grant Thornton. And the fact is nobody really wanted to own the whole thing because we all owned a piece of it. And Teams is the same way. So IT, information governance, information security, legal/compliance, knowledge management, privacy, and even the business have a say in how we should be deploying Teams and Microsoft 365. So, what I think I talk about this later, what we eventually looked into doing was actually creating a governance committee to oversee how Teams and Microsoft 365 would be deployed. So some things to consider in terms of governance is the admin center. So it's a little intimidating to be given administrative access to behind the scenes of Microsoft 365, but I did gain it. I did learn about it. I was very cautious about how I used it. And I had limited administrative capabilities. But within the admin center, this is where you control group settings, including external access, links to cloud storage, and access to third-party apps. So that's within the admin center. And then there is a Teams admin center, which I also had access to. This is where you can drill down into some team-specific settings, including messaging policies that address whether chats and posts are available, whether gifts and stickers are allowed. And then finally, there is the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, which includes an information protection and governance solution catalog. And that's where you can address retention settings, including retentions of chats and posts within Teams, where you can set up a file plan and create retention labels. I haven't even talked at all about retention labels, but that is a big capability within Microsoft 365 that allows you to put retention requirements in place. I'll just mention really briefly, retention labels started off kind of simplistic and not very useful. And as Microsoft has come to understand more and more the demands of the records management community, they've made it more sophisticated in the process. They've also made it more complicated, and it really takes a lot of education to understand how to work with them. But in any event, this is where you would create retention labels, and it is where you will find the EDiscovery Center, where you can conduct searches and apply and release legal holds. So these are all, I think, important administrative behind-the-scenes capabilities that those who are in records management or information governance should really think about making sure either they have access to it or they understand it well enough to be able to ask someone in IT to help them with the settings. So another thing to think about is if you don't get all the controls that you need out of Microsoft 365, there are governance tools that you can invest in. And at Grant Thornton, we solicited proposals from a number of companies in the fall of 2019, and we chose a company called AvePoint that helped us with some gaps. We replaced self-provisioning with a form that is reviewed and approved prior to provisioning, so it incorporates a workflow. People fill out what they're looking for, what they want to call the team, who should be members, who should be owners. It is sent to people who then review it, make sure that it is following our agreed upon terms of use for teams, and then either approve it or deny it. This is where we also make sure that the privacy settings for teams are set to private, which means it's available to specific uses versus public, available to everyone in the firm. Every place I've worked has had someone who accidentally posted a SharePoint site as available to everyone that might have very sensitive information in it that shouldn't be seen by everyone. We also used AvePoint to collect and maintain metadata to assist lifecycle management and EDiscovery. And we had a requirement for at least 2 owners per team, and we used this tool to enforce that and to maintain it. And we also, although Microsoft 365 allows for site expiration policies, we use this tool to add different layers of additional functionality to those policies. So all of those controls also apply to provisioning and maintenance of Microsoft groups and SharePoint site collections. So we were doing it not just for teams, but for everything that was supported by a group. So in conclusion, Microsoft Teams is popular, and it's popular for a reason. For those who have gotten to know it and work with it, they like it because it's a single interface for everything they need to do. They don't need to open Word and Excel and PowerPoint and an Outlook and SharePoint. It's all there in a single interface. Depending on how you've got it set up, it creates less burden on IT because there is so much self-service integrated into it. And then there's always new features and functionalities, which some people like. But you shouldn't expose Teams to your organization until you understand it. And I realized cows out of the barn for a lot of people. They had to go to start using Teams. And so like Grant Thornton, you're probably playing catch up right now. But the best practice is if you have doubts about new features or functionality, don't release it until you get a chance to understand it thoroughly. You should assign someone to monitor those upcoming upcoming features and functionalities. This is actually something that we did at Grant Thornton. We created a committee, and now we're talking about doing the exact same thing at Davis Wright Tremaine. So we get that village that can make decisions and understand the risks versus the benefits, and then get access to the admin center and make all the changes and that you need to make in order to control according to your desires. Decide on certain settings before you turn it on. I would pay particular attention to guest access, to retention of chats and posts, to gifts and stickers, links to cloud storage and third-party apps. And while I haven't talked about it, Teams, actually, one of the things about it is that it's a big change from what people may be used to, unless there are people who, like millennials are very familiar with, for instance, Slack, and they embrace it right away. But for some of us baby boomers, when you first look at Teams, you get deer in the headlights kind of a look, because it's just not the same experience you're used to. So it takes a while to get to know how to work with it to its best advantage. So look at a strong organizational change management program to support that. And then finally, happy to answer your questions today. You're also welcome to reach out to me. Here's my email address. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. If you reach out to me on LinkedIn, please tell me that you heard me speak at today's webinar. I get lots of LinkedIn invitations, and I usually do not accept them from people I don't know. So you can also follow me on Twitter. So that's it. I am going to stop presenting.
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. And now we will be queuing up what Meaghan has prepared for us.
All right, everyone, I'm going to play Meaghan's recording, if you'll give me one moment. All right, there we go.
My name is Meaghan Fukunaga. I'm the Deputy Director of Records Management for the Indiana Archives and Records Administration. And I'll be talking about Indiana's journey with M365, specifically Teams, over the last few years. Here in Indiana, we have deployed M365 in a slightly different way than elsewhere. I'll start with a little bit of an overview of the state and how we are structured, and then go into some of the history behind M365 and our path to where we are today, and how we are tackling some of the admittedly complex records management questions. We have about 130 agencies overall. We have a centralized IT department, the Indiana Office of Technology, or IoT for short. IoT has systematically moved towards enterprise-wide solutions and away from the more homegrown or agency-specific solutions, with exceptions here and there. The bigger agencies have their own internal departments that work with IoT on these deployments, while the smaller agencies rely on IoT for tech support almost entirely. IoT, therefore, is generally the business owner and administrator of any system-wide technology. They are the ones who seek a solution, implement the solution, and configure the solution once it is in place. And it's important to keep that ownership in mind as I talk about how Indiana has deployed M365 and Teams. As you can see in the timeline on your screen, M365 was rolled out system-wide by IoT in 2016. So in contrast to many other places where pilots are conducted, M365 in Indiana was available fairly widely from the beginning. It was available, but not necessarily widely adopted in any kind of meaningful sense. Some of the larger agencies took to it early on, but most state workers did not even necessarily know Teams existed. By 2017, it had been more widely adopted, but was still mostly used by power users. In 2018, IoT launched a new initiative to help drive adoption, the Work Smart 365 Champions Group. People would apply to become champions for their agency. They would become early adopters, help support other new users, and generally promote the technology within their own agencies. Each year, IoT and Microsoft would sponsor a WorkSmart 365 Champions Conference, where users could listen to the latest developments both from Microsoft and Indiana, attend workshops with Microsoft, and collaborate with other M365 users at a variety of levels. This program really helped to launch M365 and more specifically Teams to new audiences and a wider audience. In 2019, my agency became involved. We had not until this point used M365. Excuse me. We were not early adopters or power users. We don't have our own IT department, and this was not something we had participated in. We also had not been able to engage with IoT about M365 when it came to records management, really at all. I onboarded around this time, and my role was a new one specifically created to address initiatives like M365 with regards to electronic records management. And this was one of the first things, if not the first big thing I worked on. So we joined the Champions group and began trying to find seats at various decision-making tables. Then just as we were starting to make some headway, 2020 hit and use skyrocketed during remote work. And nowhere was this more evident than in Teams. As you can see, during February, March of last year, we saw some significant increases in use. A 427% increase in conversations, a 514% increase in Teams chats. These are some big percentages. It was fairly safe to say that Teams had arrived. So most of 2021 has been about catching up with 2020. Teams is a very fun tool. It's user-friendly, it's collaborative, it's designed to be appealing. People enjoy using it, and sometimes this can lead to people overlooking consequences, records management consequences. And all of this drive for adoption coincided with a public sector in Indiana that was working remotely for the first time. And we were all needing ways to connect with each other quickly and easily. So from Microsoft's marketing perspective, this was a match made in heaven. But from a records management perspective, not so much. From the beginning, it seemed like we had options. When we started out, we thought that we had a choice between configuring the admin tenant to take advantage of retention policies and labeling, or contracting with a third-party vendor to implement a tool to fill in any gaps in M365. But after much discussion and testing, we found out that in reality, our options were fairly limited. But I'll start with the good. User education is where we are focused in Indiana. Right now, we are looking at teaching people to use Teams responsibly from the beginning, opposed to operating automated records management via the tenant or third-party tool. We have, as such, developed a handy guide that requires no extra funding, no additional software, and no special tech skills. It's designed to be followed by any diligent user who's interested in better managing their records up front. We call it Teams Types, and I'll cover it in more detail on the next slides, but it's meant to create a framework that any Teams user in the state of Indiana can look to for guidance. So that's the good news. And user education is our primary focus because of these next two items on the slide. I do want to briefly say here that if you are in a similar boat, this is not the end of the world. It's just not necessarily as ideal as it could be, but this is fixable. Indiana has a G3 license, and you can click through once you get the slides and read more about that if you're not familiar with it. For now, because Microsoft is always changing capabilities and moving buttons and shifting functionalities, I'm going to focus on the big picture and what it has looked like for Indiana over the last couple years, rather than getting too into the weeds and possibly telling you something that is out of date. But basically, it has limited records management automation capabilities compared to the G5 license, which is the next step up, limited labeling, and some fairly serious EDiscovery limitations. Most importantly, though, we have learned somewhat painfully over the last 2 years that it has third-party vendor limitations as well. Early on, we worked with AvePoint to try to build a solution for some of the information governance concerns that agencies had about using M365 in their day-to-day work. But it soon became clear that without a G5 license, many of the potential solutions developed by AvePoint would not be implementable. We also discovered that core eDiscovery would not, as had been suggested by Microsoft, be a sufficient workaround for some records management needs, such as extracting a transcript of a chat for transfer to the Indiana archives. After much back and forth with a Microsoft rep, we learned that in order to extract a comprehensive transcript that preserved sufficient context for archival purposes, we would need to purchase both the advanced eDiscovery module as well as a G5 license. The cost of this is severely prohibitive, so we must make the best of our core eDiscovery module and G3 license. Further complicating matters, Indiana implemented a single tenant for all 130 agencies. In a nutshell, this means that any solutions that are implemented will be seen by all agencies. 130 plus agencies that all have very different requirements, needs, and wants and uses of teams. So any labels that we apply will be seen by everybody. Any retention policies will be applied to everyone. And any third-party vendor solutions must work for all agencies. And it was really this last one that resulted in hours of discussion. As one agency would find a solution that they liked, another one would want a slightly different solution. And in the end, Indiana has gone with no third-party vendor tool to date. My agency even tried to craft some very general, very, very high-level retention policies that could be implemented in the tenant by breaking our general schedule into year categories, 3, 5, 10, 15, and permanent. Excuse me. But we soon realized that this was too broad, and users would quickly become confused by the number of exceptions that would fall between the cracks of our plan, and also with trying to fit their agency-specific schedules into this overly broad mold. So we shelved the idea of using retention policies or labels at all for a records management perspective. So here we are. We've turned our attention to user education instead of that tenant configuration or third-party tools. And we have developed a 2-page guide to records management in Teams. We focus specifically on Teams of all of the M365 products because of the explosion of use and its complexities when it comes to records management. Basically, we wanted to address the most popular tool while reaching the most people. IoT has life cycles. They apply to Teams at the point of creation. So we started with these. We then developed business use cases that reflected the most common uses of Teams across the state, and combined the two to create a framework we hope is user-friendly and a relatively straightforward way to manage records in Teams. On a side note, I was asked a few months ago if these could also be applied to channels within a team, and think that that's a fantastic idea. And I would love to hear from anyone if you try that. I've started testing this in some of my own channels, and it's working really well so far. IoT's life cycles, you can see on your screen there at the top, are short-term, long-term, and operational. These life cycles have been in use as far as we know from the initial deployment of Teams, so users are relatively familiar with them, or they should be. When someone brings up a new team, they fill out an application and must indicate which life cycle their team will have. As far as I know, IoT does not check in with users at the end of the team's indicated life cycle, but it is still useful for our records management purposes, as it does get users thinking about disposition, even if just at a very high level from the beginning. My guess is that of these, operational life cycles are the most common, and that many people in the state are using channels within an operational team to satisfy use cases that fall under short-term and long-term teams, but I don't have the data to back that up, so it's just speculation based on user feedback and what I hear from other agencies. So to go along with these, we developed administrative, collaborative, and executive business use cases, and this was based on what we were hearing from champions as we listened to them talk about their teams. Listening to agencies talk with AvePoint, we sat in hours and weeks of conversations. And working with IoT. IoT has a unique window into statewide use, so their feedback and information was extremely valuable in all of this. Administrative teams distribute information regarding day-to-day operations of an agency, division, etc. It's important to note here that these teams should not create new original records of their own, but rather share out information created and saved elsewhere, meaning outside of the SharePoint, which is associated with the team. These teams can have any of the 3 IoT life cycles. An example of this is my agency's personnel team, which is used to share out news, information, and announcements with all staff. The newsletters, the meeting minutes are all saved elsewhere, and this just serves as a way of sharing out the information. A collaborative team is project-based, and these tend to be devoted to a specific topic. It may also have multiple agencies, divisions, etc., and external guests. External guests are here defined as a non-state of Indiana employee, so this could be a contractor, a vendor, similar. These have an IoT lifecycle of short-term or long-term. An example of this is a team IoT created to work on a long-term e-record storage solution for my agency. All project documents and meeting recordings are meant to be housed there, but the team itself will be decommissioned at the end of the year when the project ends. Last but not least, we have the executive team, which is used by management to collaborate on policy or internal actions. This can have either a long-term or operational life cycle. An example of this is Indiana's State Continuity Working Group, which is managed by the Indiana Department of Homeland Security and brings cross-agency decision makers together to discuss COOP, business continuity, and training. And I do want to point out that on the previous slide, this slide, and I believe the next slide, there is a link at the bottom. And if you would like to see the 2-page document that we have developed on this so that it's all in one comprehensive, easy to use place, you can click on that and it'll take you there. So once we had our teams types created, we applied some basic records management best practices to each of the teams types, and then also some best practices that apply to all teams. We'll start on this slide with the practices that are specific to each of the different kinds of teams types, and then on the next slide, we'll get to the general best practices. Excuse me. We kept these as broad as possible since they need to be useful to all 30,000 state employees and all 130 plus agencies. So we focused on conversations and file management. And these are two of the most complex but also easiest to tackle when you compare them to chats. Administrative teams should generally have conversations turned off, with the exception being something like a how-to channel. And a good example of this is the team that we use for our oversight committee, where we have a help channel for new members who have questions, excuse me, about monthly meetings or the team itself. Collaborative teams, by their very nature, pretty much are required to have conversations turned on, as their name would suggest, but we do encourage people to use those conversations for topics that do not result in records that would fall under permanent retention or need to be transferred to the Indiana archives. And last, executive teams should have conversations turned off or used to a very limited extent. A good example of this is the team IRA uses, my agency, uses for management to communicate with each other. One channel is devoted to working drafts of minutes and agendas, and the conversation in this channel is limited to announcements that the next meeting agenda is posted. So no policymaking, decision-making, or similar conversation ever happens in this team. File management in teams is a little trickier. It is a wonderful collaboration tool and can make working together on documents much easier and faster. So we have tried to walk the very fine line between responsible records management and the fun collaborative nature of teams when we developed our file management advice. I won't read all of this, and you can always follow the link to read all of the details, but in essence, teams should strive to only contain files which are copies of originals saved and maintained outside of the team, or working drafts that will be saved outside of the team when they are complete. I know that this has been a lot of information to throw at you, so I figured I'd summarize the advice common across all teams types on one handy slide. And of course, you can always click that link to download a copy to read at your convenience. Excuse me, so sorry. We highly recommend that teams owners create a history document when they first bring up a team. This will be the primary record of all major decisions made in the team, from new members to new channels to deletions. It's a very handy reference to have available as teams grow and age over the years, because it becomes really easy to forget why you did what and what you did. Perform regular file cleanups during which old or unused files are deleted and drafts and final copies are moved to an appropriate location external to Teams. This is just generally good records management advice, which honestly much of this slide is, but it never hurts to repeat it often, so we've included it here. Assign cleanup responsibilities to one team owner and set a cleaning schedule when the team is initially set up. An example of this is the team we have for our oversight committee. The team is cleaned of all minutes, agendas, and supplementary materials at the end of each month after the committee has held their monthly meeting. My co-owner of the team takes responsible for cleaning and ensuring final copies of records are saved on our server. Everything else we assume is falling under short-term retention, our general files retention, and therefore does not need to be removed from the team. Before deleting files, always verify that the originals exist in or are copied to their proper external locations. Again, commonly given records management advice, but it bears repeating because we have found that there can be a significant lag of up to a day before files are actually copied from SharePoint. Never use a team's conversation as the sole record of any policy, legal, or similar decision or discussion. I put this one last because I can't say it enough, and I'd like to leave you with this main thought. Especially the way Indiana has deployed it, Teams is so easy to use and seems like such a conversational tool that it's easy to forget that it may not be possible to extract a comprehensive record of a conversation or chat transcript. A good example of this, regardless of which license you have, are the reactions that users can give to chats and conversations. Thumbs up, heart, smile, surprise, sad, and angry faces are all options users have to interact with posts, and at least in Indiana, they use these liberally. However, Microsoft has confirmed that these reactions are not accessible anywhere but in the Teams interface. So for example, if you do have EDiscovery and the G5, you still, according to Microsoft, cannot pull a transcript that preserves the reactions. This might seem trivial, but the number of decisions that have been made with a thumbs up alone means it's far more serious than the words emoticon, emoji, and smiley face might actually imply. Thank you for listening. This is just one state's experiences so far with M365, but I hope it has been of use. My contact information is on the screen, and please don't ever hesitate to reach out. I love hearing how others are using M365 and learning about new possibilities. It is nothing if not a group effort to manage records in Teams. Thank you, and I will now pass this along to the next presenter. My name is
All right,
Meaghan
well,
Fukunaga.
thank you. Thank you, Meaghan. No, she's not here. I did want to say for the state agencies, we do have a storage matrix. It's kind of like what Meaghan was talking about. It's something we've come up with, and it hasn't been necessarily approved, but we have like a draft that we've been passing out to people. So my plan was to send those to the attendees here today so that you could have a copy of it. So our next speaker is Phillip Walter from the Adams County.
All righty. Good morning, everyone. Can you see my screen okay? Very nice. Okay. Well, I like to believe I'm here to represent the little guys today. I think there was a lot of really good information that was provided today in terms of M365, O365, and the way that different organizations digest this system is quite different. You know, there's resource limitations. There are limitations in understanding what this stuff even means. There's different starting points, right? And in local government, our constraints that we have typically fall under, you know, do you have the proper people to manage a system of this magnitude? Do you have policies in place to manage any of this sort of stuff? How much time does it take to even get the discussion across the finish line to even procure the licenses? So we as Adams County are what I would consider maybe a mid-size class, county being a class 5. It's just a little bit of information on us here. So really we don't fall in the smaller counties. We don't really fall in the larger counties. We have 15 IT total staff within Adams County, Pennsylvania. And that's what we have to manage the IT portfolio. and O365 is just one of those pieces. So I think what will be helpful here is to see our timeline, and I'm basically going to take you guys through the story of us, Adams County, and how O365 came to be. And I hope you can pick up on some realistic challenges that do come up over time with the system, and those that haven't deployed it yet can hit on some of these big notes that we discovered. So COVID-19, that was the big precedence why Adams County needed to bring the O365 package in, specifically Teams, right? So we had people working from home, and that was very different. County government, that is extremely different than what most of us are used to. Even today, a lot of counties have moved a lot of workers back to the office just because, again, that's the traditional way that things are done. However, when COVID-19 hit, we had important discussions with our commissioners, with our courts, with some of our elected officials to find out, do we need these tools to be able to keep the county government functioning? We didn't have the tools. We had email. We didn't really have a unified collaboration solution. We did not have a unified chat function. We did not have a unified video solution. We had some departments that have dabbled in it, maybe had their own one-off solution, but there was nothing unifying the entire organization together. So we knew quickly when we purchased the licenses. Fortunately, even as a Class 5 county, we were actually able to stand the O365 environment up mostly in-house. We didn't have a lot of vendors that we needed to work with, really none, to get our initial footprint with O365 in place. And just because it's cloud-based does not mean that there are not caveats or more internal resource needs that you're going to need to even get the system stood up to begin with. So for the little guys, that's not something you can really look past, let alone when we get to the discussions about the management side. So just deploying it and setting it up right and making sure that it's functional and it's working the way it's supposed to has a huge piece to it. So at Adams County, we procured the licenses, we stood the system up, and we said, okay, departments, COVID-19's here, use it. Very little insight into how they should use it. IT department of us 15 had never used O365. We didn't know what it was all about in comparison to any other department. So of course, just like we said with other state agencies or private organizations, there's people that are within your organization that are going to buy into using the platform, and there's those that are never going to touch it at all. And we saw certain departments move forward with it very quickly. We said, great, this is good. Use the platform. Sounds like you're collaborating. You're setting these teams up. Okay, great. And now you're setting up chats as well. We didn't really know the difference between the two, but it's here. It's here to use. Go ahead and use it. And what I actually found was that there were many departments, some of what we call our super users that are inside of various departments within our county government, knew more about it than what we did, right? But then the big question comes up, ownership, right? So you've had legacy systems from document management systems that never really had a true owner at our level of government, where maybe the IT department used a vendor, for instance, to manage all the questions or all the administrative setup that different departments would ask for. Well, after 10 years of using a system, if you don't have ownership, I promise you, it's very hard to backtrack and go and clean stuff up. So once we started deploying this, and we used it approximately for about a year, we started having a few seminars, and we started talking about it with the various departments about like the sales side of it, right? Use it, it's going to enhance your business. It'll make it a lot easier to get your work done. You don't need to use just email. Well, of course, questions start to come up, as they should, from the legal department. And they say, well, what are people putting up here, Phil? I don't know. Well, that's kind of problematic. If we don't know 100% how departments are using it, how are we then going to avoid turning this into one of those 10-year systems and it turns into a pool of various data from records that do need to be managed and have a proper schedule that must be met? And how do you differentiate that from just the chats? So very quickly, after about a year, we said, okay, yeah, we're going to have to learn more about how this works. And I think as Elizabeth had up there, I started diving into those same charts, and I said, oh boy, this is not just email. And just to note, as I'm an active participant at the County Commissioners Association of Pennsylvania IT groups, there are many counties that still haven't gotten retention figured out for email. So very quickly, and basically they're keeping those indefinite. So when you go and you look at the charts on how this is stored, from Exchange to OneDrive to SharePoint and everything in between, we said, uh-oh, this is going to get a lot more complex. So we had to start with the broad question. And after 9 years of working in our county, in Adams County, I knew we had to take this back again to as a simplistic level as we could. And it's basically what many other counties have to do as well. You have a lot of different interests when it comes to globalized systems like O365, from the elected offices to the courts to the county offices. All have different uses. Some move forward with it much more quickly than others. Some have concerns, but yet, how are you going to manage this all under one umbrella? Otherwise, how many staff is it going to take for me to have to manage this individually with each office or each branch of government? It gets very complicated very quickly. So the cart definitely got ahead of the horse. We started to look at what were departments doing within teams. We discovered great uses, fantastic uses. They were setting up subcommittees within their departments, specific chat groups that needed to be created. And we started to see that really chats were kind of being used similar to how teams, the formalized teams, were being used. And very quickly, after understanding the way the platform worked and after collaborating with my team and my system admin and others within the IT department, we discovered pretty quickly, as was previously noted by Elizabeth, is that there are very different use cases in how you can use these different functions. And we said, well, chat's one thing, a formalized team is a completely different thing. And we're using formalized teams for Susie's upcoming birthday party. We've got a problem here, right? So we now have to backtrack and we have to get this back into a format where chats are chats, teams are teams, and then we have to talk about retention, right? So we've been working over the last year to clean up now, or maybe 6 months or so, to clean up a lot of that initial problematic stuff that was set up and create uniformity with structured department teams. Then chats will stay as chats, the informal side. Our maturity level certainly is not what was presented prior, but by any means. And I think a lot of counties that have deployed this are probably in a similar situation as we are. But the difference was, what we're doing is we're going to actually get the cart back behind the horse, and we're going to find out what this thing really can do. So how do you do that, right? Well, we had to define, what are we using Teams for and what are we not? So we took a big globalized approach, and we are going to be taking a big globalized approach to basically saying this entire environment as of today, now it will change down the road, but this environment today is going to be temporary, period. No official records will reside here. It's just a temporary space to collaborate. It's a temporary space to share documentation. You can do what you need to do. However, all of that, when you're done with it, will go back to the traditional locations, such as a shared drive, document management systems that we've used in the past, email, so be it. We have to get a handle on what the system is to be used for and what it is not. So we're defining what the final retention period is going to be globally across the entire tenant, from OneDrive to Teams to SharePoint, and it's just going to auto-purge everything out after that period of time. So anything that is of substance is to be moved back down to the local drives and the local locations that we're used to. Again, story about small government, story about how do you get your hands wrapped around this. So COVID was the unique change with this. Normally, we would have deployed very slowly. We would have talked about what do these features mean, but COVID definitely pushed it forward faster. A lot of us say, probably everywhere, but certainly in county government, what took 1 year to deploy probably would have taken at least 5 years in county government to get to the point of what we did in 1 year. So that's a pretty big deal. It's a lot to take on, and now you are looked at as the resident experts of a system of this magnitude, and it can be overwhelming. So that is how we're reverting back. That is how we're taking control of the environment. It's basically taking everything and trying to set it up in small chunks. Now, is the future this entire platform? Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. But even the thought of that, just having those thoughts about, oh, a traditional network drive is going to go away, and now you're going to use Teams, or you're going to use OneDrive, or you're going to use these things to do this. Well, Phil, somebody here needs to understand how this whole thing works. So once again, in county government, that means you have to do it very slowly and very methodical process from legal, county management, court management, elected officials. We all need to be aligned and understand where this thing is going. So from a high level, these are the lessons learned to date. Basically, a lot of what I talked about in that story encompasses what is basically here. And those have been the trouble areas. I mean, I'm very proud that we are a county that has been able to deploy this system. I feel confident that we've caught it before it turned into something that's even harder to revert back from. But for those that don't have all of the governance committees or governance people at the state level, private organizations, you have to really think about this system and what it's going to be used for and what it is not. So we are taking, again, the broad assumption, or not even assumption at this point, but we are taking the broad approach that this is simply going to be used as a temporary location. We're going to get the most out of the product that we can today, and then we're going to get more out of it as time goes on here. But yeah, the limiting of end user control, it all goes back to that. But you really need to find out, as we said, who's the owner? Is it the IT department? Is it the CIO? Is it a combination of multiple individuals? For us today, that kind of sits on my shoulders, but I do believe it will be dispersed over time with subcommittees or an O365 committee that will talk about how it's going to be rolled out. But somebody has to be able to explain that internally. Someone has to have an understanding of, if you're going to do X, what is, the end result going to be, and how's it going to affect other things. We're trying to contain this within as much of a vacuum as we can within Teams itself and the auxiliary pieces that come with that, such as we're saving to Exchange and saving to OneDrive, saving to SharePoint. But we are getting questions already about, well, what about the other products to integrate with it? What is that going to be? And we're just not in a position yet to answer those questions. We will get there. We eventually will find our way there. But again, I want to point back that in county government, when we have many counties today that are saving emails indefinitely, basically as far back as the appliance can hold or the server keeps going, we've got a lot of work to do before we're going to be ready to handle and tackle something like this. So within Adams County, we do have policies in place to control email, and we're going to try to mirror a lot of that stuff to the existing policies. But policies change, evolve, and have to mature over time. But we, within the unique structure of county government, have a lot of differentiating and not always aligning interests across multiple lines of government. And again, finding that unified person, the person that is responsible and owns the Teams environment, owns the O365 environment, that is the key to everything. And then you can roll out within whatever speed or velocity that you decide to go is totally up to you then. And then this is the last set of lessons learned here. I think we hit a little bit on, but I do want to once again reiterate the use of external vendors. They have value. They will help you get things stood up. But a lot of this is going to come back to your internal decision makers as to how you're going to deploy certain things. What are your choices that you have to put retention in place for various types of documents? A lot of those questions are going to go back to that small little IT team that's sitting there, and you may need a partner to help you. You may need a partner to help you deploy it. You may need a partner to help you even understand what's there. We're taking it chunk by chunk and understanding, looking at the policies that are on the back end and saying, okay, looks like we can apply this. We can apply it for one day, as we said, like limit it that much, and it will just get rid of everything, or you go years. So it can change significantly. Did you have a question, Cindy? I saw the hand raise.
No, that was a mistake.
Okay, no problem at all. So yeah, and I'm right at the end here. So I think at this point, I've given all the information that I have on what we've done, the high level points of what Adams County's experience with this. So I hope it related to a lot of departments or a lot of organizations, I should say, that are out there with the semantics of how the system works, the complexities that are on the back end, but also the reality of what can hit a smaller government that wants to deploy something of this magnitude. So thank you, Cindy, and I will turn it back over to you. So thank you so much for allowing me to present today.
Oh, thank you, Phil, for being here. We appreciate it. So if anybody has any questions for Phil or Elizabeth or even Meaghan, if you could put them in the question and answer or in the chat. You might have noticed that somebody had put in the documents that she was referring to, the URL for that in the chat. Okay.
I have a question for Phil. I noticed during your presentation, you talked about, was it September of 2019 that you acquired M365 licenses? And you mentioned COVID associated with that, but that wasn't known until later. So did I miss something?
And unless I got my dates wrong there, but if bottom line is once COVID came along, that is when that is when we procured the licenses. So my dates have been maybe a little off there, which I apologize for. But
okay.
Yes, bottom line is COVID created this scenario, and we needed to purchase the licenses.
But you jumped on it early. I mean, you jumped on it before everybody started working from home.
We did it right around the time when we started to identify that we had to get people to start working from home. So again, if my dates are off, I apologize, but the message is still the same.
Wow. Yeah, pretty impressive.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I learned something from Meaghan's presentation. I didn't realize that in EDiscovery you don't capture the emoji. So learn something new every day.
All right. Well, we do have the email addresses of our speakers. So if anybody has any other questions after the session, please feel free to write to them or us, because we'd be interested in the answers, of course, too. So, all right. Okay. Oh, I do see there's maybe one. Okay, we do have one question. Are any of the presenters using M365 as a records management system repository?
So I will answer that on behalf of Grant Thornton, where yes, I mean Grant Thornton started using SharePoint quite some time ago. So they started developing an approach to managing content within SharePoint a decade or more ago. Now, when I joined the firm, they had done a lot of good jobs in terms of setting up, I'm thinking here specifically of client engagement content, of setting some controls up for managing it during the engagement, but they had not thought through how they were going to manage deletion once the retention requirement was met. So that was something we were still working on when I left Grant Thornton. But they also developed a new platform to support client engagements across the tax advisory and audit groups, which all had their own approaches to managing their client engagement records. So they did create a new platform that had a front end, but integrated on the back end with Microsoft 365. So they never invested in a document management system to do that. They've leveraged as much as they can SharePoint. They've had to put a lot of controls in place and a lot of investment, a lot more than I think most companies would be willing to invest. But you know, at Davis Wright Tremaine, we do have a document management system where the official records are intended to be stored. So here we don't have that approach, at least not yet. but we are exploring whether that's possible. I think it takes a lot of work, a lot of investment, and some third-party tools in order to do that.
Right.
And of course, in Adams County, we're just going to use the environment temporary for now. So the answer is no.
Okay. All right. Well, with no other questions, oh, there is one. Do you recommend using 365 as a records management tool, or to invest in a third-party document management system, Elizabeth?
I think a lot depends on the granularity of your requirements. If you are going to use Microsoft 365, I definitely think it needs to be reinforced with other third-party tools. I think it's possible. I think the records management team will have to do a very deep dive into retention labels. I've heard a lot of skeptics in terms of how retention labels work, and I know Microsoft has set it up so that the best benefit from retention labels is with the E5 or G5 license, as opposed to the more common E3 or G3 license. So it probably will require investment in E5 in order to truly make it work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm skeptical, but willing to pursue it, is the way I would describe myself.
All right. Well, thank you, Phil and Elizabeth. This has been very helpful, and I know our audience really appreciated your time for this. So with that, we will say goodbye, and then if any of you are going to our 1:30 session, I'll see you back then. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.